Okay, I'm going to start the broadcast now.
We will be starting in just a moment. I see a number of folks joining, so we'll give it one more minute and then we'll start our conversation. Thank you.
I think Connor could recite a poem in the meantime, maybe just to entertain anyone spontaneously. I'm sure you prepared something.
You said me?
Yeah, I was just joking.
I'll keep one in my, maybe I'll recite one in my head. Thanks.
I couldn't either.
Okay, we're gonna get started. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for this really important discussion around rural America and urban America and what's happening economically on the ground, differences and similarities. I'm Seti Warren, I'm the Executive Director of Shorenstein Center. And I also want to acknowledge WGBH for partnering with us in live streaming this important event. Before we get into the panel discussion, I did want to mention the work that our senior fellow, Tara Westover, and I have started at the Shorenstein Center. What we aim to do is dig deep and really tell the story of what's happening on the ground in our country today. We know there are two Americas. There's one America where people are connected to an ecosystem that gives them solid financial foundation. And there's another America where they're not connected to that ecosystem. And beneath that, of course, there are racial disparities and regional disparities. We know that the traditional way that we measure what's happening to the health of our economy, unemployment, GDP, and stock market are insufficient as far as capturing the two Americas that we live in. So our aim is to tell that story and weave in the latest data and research to tell that story and make it available to journalists, public policymakers, academics, and the general public at large. We're really pleased that Shorenstein Center will be partnering with the Wiener Center to move this work forward. Now let's get into our panel discussion. I'm really excited to be joined with folks I've gotten to know over the last number of months and years. I want to start with Connor Sheets. He's an investigative reporter for the Alabama Media Group. And most importantly to me, Goldsmith finalist last year at the Shorenstein Center. Welcome, Connor. Great to be with you. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Next, Philip Martin, senior investigative reporter for the WGBH News Center for Investigative Reporting based in Boston. He's an award-winning journalist. It's great to be with you. Philip, thank you for joining this afternoon.
Thank you, Seti. It's great to be here with all my friends here.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gordon Hanson. He's the Peter Wertheim Professor of Urban Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and at the Wiener Center. Gordon, it is really great to be with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Seti. It's really a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, my colleague and friend, Tara Westover. As many of you know, she's an award-winning author of Educated and Senior Research Fellow at the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get started. What I want to do first is hand things over to Gordon to give us sort of a high-level landscape as far as where we are economically, and then get into some of the regional questions and divides there between urban and rural. And of course, this is all through the lens of this COVID-19 crisis. We already knew the divide was there, divides were there economically, but COVID-19 has shown a big light on it. But Gordon, if you could give us a landscape, that would be great to get the conversation started.
Sure, and thanks for queuing that up very nicely. So before COVID hit, I think it's important to understand two big forces that had helped create the regional economic divides in America and cement them in place. One was a series of changes that happened after 1980, in particular after 2000, in which the prime dynamic industries in the American economy, which are tech and finance and professional business services, became increasingly more concentrated in bigger cities. That's where the productivity growth happened. That's where the income growth happened. That's where young, educated workers concentrated. And if you wanted to get on that path to success, you pretty much needed to be in one of those places. What that meant was for smaller and medium-sized towns, you were increasingly left with less educated workers, with older workers, and with sunset industries. So that was the tableau going into the Great Recession. So what the Great Recession did was to take that existing set of differences and kind of blow them up. We saw it hit particular regions really hard, and those were areas where less skilled workers were more concentrated, where people were more tapped out in terms of home mortgages and personal debt. And the job loss that was experienced after the Great Recession, we only got part of that back over the intervening 10 years. It's a lot of discussion about unemployment rates. I know that Seti, you and Tara have talked a lot about kind of how we measure and how we communicate a sense of social and economic dislocation. I'll throw out my own personal favorite statistic, which is just how many people have jobs, what fraction of the working age population is employed. And we saw that drop by about 5%, which is a big change during the Great Recession, only clawed about half of that back, but we clawed almost none of it back in the places that were hard hit. So that's the tableau when COVID hits, and COVID has had so far played itself out in 3 acts. Act 1 was just kind of the across the board shutdown, and that kind of hit everybody the same. And that was April to May. Then in Act 2, we had this partial reopening, and then we got to see the frontline industries that were hit most dramatically: hospitality, retail, travel. And those were actually more concentrated in bigger cities. So bigger cities saw the larger increases in unemployment and more of that immediate hardship. And so our sense right now is that rural areas, smaller towns might be a little bit more insulated. But now we're going into Act 3, and that's where the fallout of all of this will start to hit. And that's going to start to look like a more normal recession. And what happens in more normal recessions is that less skilled workers take harder hits. Those who are more indebted take harder hits, and those who are not tied to those dynamic industries, the ones that have been driving U.S. economic growth for the last couple of decades, are going to have harder times for economic recovery. So right now, we've been really focused on kind of what's happened in bigger, more successful cities. I think as we go forward in time, our concern needs to revert back to the areas that we had lost sight of, the left behind America, because they're set up to experience a lot of pain in the remainder of this year and in the next year.
Thank you, Gordon. I want to shift to Philip. Gordon describes this dramatically altered landscape in the last 4 or 5 months in urban areas, in particular cities in particular, that could shift again. But we know pre-COVID, as Gordon acknowledged, there are inequities in all these places. I wonder if you could share, as a journalist, Philip, your observations of what you've seen over the last several months, sort of, putting transferring the data into story and observation. Tell us what you're seeing.
Sure, absolutely, Seti. Thank you. And thank you, Gordon. Um, it's awful. I will preface it that way. I've spoken with hotel workers, or those who were working in hotels, of course, before COVID-19, housekeepers, people who cook for a living, folks who clean, so on and so forth. Not just hotels, but I'm giving hotels as one example of the hospitality industry that Gordon referenced. These people are out of jobs. They were doing badly before, struggling for 15, if you will, $15, doing badly before, struggling for 15, if you will, $15 an hour in some places, some struggling for $12 an hour. And Massachusetts is better than most in terms of payment to hospitality workers, but they're really struggling now. And I've been talking with these folks on the ground, and their lives are just absolutely miserable. And the notion that that you cannot pay people, extend something that the Senate and the Congress and the president collaborated on earlier, and extending $600 a week to these workers, and now balking at that possibility, balking at paying people money that they need and deserve. That's a big part of the landscape right now. I'm going to focus for a second, Seti, on something else that's specific to this landscape, which is small businesses, Black and Latino-owned businesses. You take the $659 billion PPP that was supposed to extend to everyone, and so on and so forth, and you find that very few Black and Latino firms have received these loans. This far into the season, when many of these loans, of course, the funding has pretty much dried up. There's some still available, but minority firms, Black and Latino firms, have received very little of this. Now, you take this fact with the fact that here in Massachusetts, for example, we've been doing a series, WGBH, called The Color of Public Money. And we found out in the color of public money, money that is supposed to go to minority contractors, Black, Latino businesses. Well, that money has actually decreased by 25% over 20 years. A lot less is going to minority firms in 2020. In 2019, it was particularly bad. But during this COVID period, during this pandemic, many of these firms have absolutely gone bust. Why is that important for the broader community? Well, we know that if you have thriving Black and Latino businesses in your community, that the community largely thrives. If you have storefronts that are empty, that are boarded up, then that also is problematic for the community. And so you drive up some of these streets, as I've done here in the Boston area, drive up Blue Hill Avenue or lower Blue Hill Avenue, and you find a lot of businesses that were indeed thriving, or at least doing well. Barbershops even no longer survive, and that is having a multiplying effect, of course, as this pandemic lingers and as the situation becomes worse, largely due to the inaction of our leadership in Washington. So that is sort of a summary of where we are. The color of public money, where you find $165 million less going to minority firms, Latino and Black firms here in Massachusetts before the pandemic, now exacerbated by this horrible crisis. And then on the ground with housekeepers and folks who are still working, even like in supermarkets. They were given, for example, a bonus. This is a story I covered earlier. Supermarket workers were given a bonus as this pandemic marched on to take Gordon's words, in Act 1 and 2. And in Act 3, the supermarkets are telling supermarket workers, we're basically rescinding that money. We think we've given you enough. We've given you an incentive to work. We've given you an incentive to stay on the job. But now we're going to claw back some of those funds, thereby exacerbating the poverty that many of these workers were experiencing during the COVID crisis as it continues, and prior to it. The notion of increasing payment for people who are putting their lives on the line, which seemed like common sense, clawing it away it is without question, as we've found in talking with many of these people, problematic to their lives and into their overall conditions. I hope that summarizes
Yes,
what
thank
I'm.
you. Thank you, Phil, for that description in great detail. You know, two takeaways from this. One, you know, and I want to emphasize a point you made. There is lasting damage here in the communities that you talk about. The Black and brown businesses shuttered that may never be able to come back at all. When we think about when people talk about a recovery, there are going to be certain areas and industries that are going to come back and recover, and others that do not. And so I think that's something for all of us to keep an eye on as data points are provided to us, whether it's unemployment, whatever it is. I think you really illustrated that quite well. I want to shift over to Connor and Tara to speak to rural America. We know, obviously, Tara, you and I have talked about this for the last year, the divides that already existed in rural America, and to a certain extent between rural and urban. And you know, Connor, we've had brief conversation. There are varying perceptions about rural America, some of which are incorrect, some of which are correct if you don't live there, if you don't come from rural America, or if you haven't lived in rural America. So can you give us just a sense of what you're seeing and hearing in regard to rural America? And I know, again, acknowledging pre-COVID, there are real issues, and now we're in COVID-19 crisis. I'll start with you, Connor, and then turn to Tara to weigh in.
Okay, so for me, I was hoping to speak a little bit about sort of from a perspective of someone who sort of has had a foot in each side of this divide. You know, I reported earlier in my career from small towns in Maryland. I've reported, worked in New York for several years as a reporter, and then I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, which is a urban area, obviously in a fairly rural state that has that's facing a lot of the issues that you're seeing nationally in rural areas. And so for me, I think, you know, continuing to live in more of an urban area but reporting on these rural areas, I have a somewhat unique perspective of being able to see, you know, sort of what issues are impacting both communities and in what ways. And so I think, but to start out with a little bit, I mean, I think this divide that we were talking about, and that this, you know, that it's important that we're talking about in this webinar today. I mean, I think that is a real thing. I think for, you know, the past 10 years leading up to maybe, you know, a couple of years ago, you know, we saw that a lot of, as we were talking about earlier, I think Phil was talking about jobs were moving to, or Gordon was talking about, I think, you know, you're seeing jobs moving to the cities. It's something we're seeing all around the world, China, places like that, where you know, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where jobs are moving to cities, and, you know, economic opportunities. And there's young people, young single people are moving away from, you know, farming communities or more rural communities to chase opportunities. And in cities, as cities have kind of been repopulated to a degree. And it's interesting, coming from, I was living in Lower Manhattan, moved to Birmingham, Alabama. And, you know, I think people who are not particularly familiar with Alabama or the South or a lot of places would think that, you know, Birmingham is going to be sort of this, I don't know the correct terminology, sort of a backwards type of place that, you know, you're going to see sort of, you know, I thought that people were going to be where, I don't know, I really had some of these perceptions as someone who grew up in the North. And really, I always tell people you can move like a part of downtown Birmingham into like a hip part of Brooklyn, and you really wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. You have a lot of the same attitudes, a lot of the same concerns, a lot of the same economic issues or economic triumphs, and a lot of the same types of jobs, that type of thing. And meanwhile, rural areas, if you go to rural Alabama and compare that to rural Maryland or upstate New York or something like that, you're going to see a lot of the same attitudes and values, as well as a lot of the same economic issues. So it's been interesting now, though, with the arrival of coronavirus and this pandemic continuing to move, continuing to have an impact. I think that we're seeing a leveling between urban and rural areas. And now for myself, I'm not an economist, I'm a journalist. I'm talking from a perspective of just what I'm seeing on the ground. But, last month, I think I reported on literally, hundreds of people long unemployment lines at the Department of Labor, where people are standing all night under the elements, waiting to try to fix their their issues with unemployment, or try to get some unemployment benefits. And talking to people in that line, anyone could be from any person you talk to could be from a city or a rural area. It really didn't discriminate. And I think what we're seeing now is some of these all these rural communities where industries left, or the factories shut down, that type of thing, or even smaller communities where farms are being bought up by corporations, or whatever else is happening that's causing these economic downturns in these communities. We're now seeing some of those impacts coming to cities in a different way, where the service industry's bottomed out because of coronavirus. Huge employer, hospitality industry, as we were talking about, but also we've had the gig economy destroy a lot, essentially take out a lot of jobs. And the economic despair is real across the board. You have 40 million people unemployed. It probably, I don't know how many more now, what the updated numbers are, but I don't think that we're seeing the divide. Is in some ways now all of America is sort of feeling what rural America has felt for a while. In my view, I don't know, I don't know all the numbers exactly and everything, but that's my view from the ground.
Tara, did you want to weigh in?
I'm also a non-economist, but I really like to pretend to be an economist in my spare time. What to say about it? I mean, everything you guys have said so far has been right. I think we've done a couple of these webinars now, and I like to talk about my hometown and how if you go back there, everything is completely boarded up, and there's now 2 funeral parlors and 1 grocery store. And I think that trend that you're talking about, kind of the hollowing out of family-owned retail, or even of somewhat locally owned retail, obviously with online shopping and Amazon and Walmart, even to a degree, all of that's been being gutted for a while now. These are trends that we've been seeing. But I think what COVID has done is it has accelerated all of that. So we already had a pretty serious online shopping, you could say, habit or problem, depending on your point of view. Now it's kind of necessary, right? I mean, it's safer. And so I think there's a lot of things that were trends that were happening anyway, but Corona has really accelerated them. And that, I think, is, I mean, we were talking about all these different types of inequity of the way people are experiencing coronavirus. And in some ways, I think we have to think a little bit about our political system, in the sense of, can we function politically as a country with these kinds of regional disparities? And I think that also applies to questions around race and minorities. Like, can we function politically as a country if we have so many generations of dispossessing people of property, lands? And I think that there's a sense in which we need to come to terms with this, both in terms of race, like, can we function as one country when we treat people so unequally, and when people's experience of the structure of our country is so different? And also in terms of geography, does it matter if New York is doing great if so many places aren't? Can we have the country that we want to have? And I think we're starting to learn that that was always an illusion. The idea that if things were going well in the capital of a state, it was fine if the rest of the state was dying. That turned out not to be real. And as we've become more separated geographically, we never spend time with each other in person because we all live in different places, and we all have different friends, and everyone's kind of in their little bubble. The more that we've separated from each other, the irony is we've had more of a negative impact on each other probably than we've ever had. We hate each other more than we ever have. And it's the nature of democracy that we kind of can't live or can't function, I think, with these kinds of deep divides. And so I think sometimes it can be hard to say, well, why should I, I live in Boston, why should I care about what's going on in Alabama or even rural Massachusetts? And I think what we've seen in the last 4 years just of our politics is it's all one country, and it will reach you eventually. So, you have to care because it's your country.
Excellent points. I want to go back to a central question after we've sort of all been through observations, and I want to key on something Tara said and Philip said. Tara talked about the hollowing out of her hometown and her community, and Philip talked about the hollowing out of these Black and brown businesses. And what's striking to me is, and that happening over time, a series of time. And you both talked about, you asked a tough question about our governing. Can we solve for this? And I also heard in different parts of this discussion with all of us that there's a real segregation, right, between all of us in a certain way that actually has made maybe the ability to govern in politics worse. I'd really love to hear from you all around those themes, because, as you all, journalists try to cover these stories, they're so complex with the various disparities embedded, whether they're racial, whether they're regional. How do we tell the story, this complex story? How do we begin to do that? One. Two, asking a central question, what needs to happen moving forward? I'll let anyone jump in based on those comments.
I think, for one thing, just briefly, I think we need to be better at connecting the dots. I applaud what Gordon had said about Act 1 and 2 and so on and so forth. But if we were to even create acts and talk about it in terms of, let's just say start with the Occupy movement. What we were covering then was a theme that we always have a hard time coming to grips with in the United States, that is income inequality. And finally, with the Occupy movement, we were able to give it a name without journalists basically feeling that we were delving into covering class warfare. A lot of folks fell for that sort of class warfare theme, and really, and a lot of journalists were afraid to cover the very real class divisions in this country that have gotten worse and worse and worse. We finally came up with this name. Of course, the Occupy movement didn't come up with the name; it simply borrowed it and addressed the issue of income inequality. And journalists started to cover that. And then we come to the present moment, and we realize, for example, that billionaires, as we've just discovered, during this pandemic have become even more, have become wealthier during the pandemic. I think what becomes important is to connect the dots. And one of the most important narratives that's being told in that regard is something that Isabel Wilkerson has been able to do with her new book, Caste. Now, I've only gotten into the very beginning of this. But as you know, Seti, I've been covering caste in America in regard to Indian Americans who are here. But now we're seeing the application of that term to try to describe what is happening in terms of what we always thought was not necessarily incontrovertible. We thought that we could always ascend and so on and so forth. And I think that people can still ascend, but I think there's also a realism and a reality that there is something that's absolutely encased in our system, and that encasement takes place in the form of caste. Now, I think the stories that we tell can be told through that prism. I think that has to be one way of approaching the stories that that we're telling. Casteism is a real problem. Racial caste is a real problem in this country. When we talk about America, for example, economically, as Tara mentioned, of catching a cold. Well, as the saying goes, Black America, Latino America gets pneumonia. And why is that? Well, partly because there are systems in place that allow, those folks of color to basically receive the worst of it. So unemployment might be dramatic. Right now, we're talking about 10% officially with the new numbers, correct? Well, we know that that's much worse in urban areas. Certainly in the areas that I've covered and where I've grew up in Detroit, that it's far worse in those areas. So I think the narrative can be contextualized in a framework of assumption that addresses this issue of racial caste. I'll go on, Tara, please.
Oh, I just wanted to add something, but if you want to finish,
I think that sums it up.
Okay, I was just thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking about, I think that you're right. There's a real resistance to people thinking or talking about income inequality because it seems more like we're pitting people against each other in some way, and it feels like class warfare. But I think there's a way to talk about it, or at least as I've thought about this question more and more, the way that it started to make sense to me is in terms of ecosystems. And what lifeline are people plugged into? Because there are places in the United States that have pretty decent social mobility for whatever reason. Salt Lake City, which I grew up close to, has for a whole bunch of reasons. You can be born fairly poor there and your odds of moving up are pretty good. And but then there are all kinds of places where that is not true at all. And where places that used to be thriving are dying, or places that actually haven't had functional systems for a really, really long time, and maybe because of discrimination and because of policies that we put in place. But I think sometimes we lose this ideological battle because we only talk about individuals, and it's very easy to kind of fall back then and say, well, personal responsibility and people should lift themselves up, and it's almost too easy to dismiss that. But I think what's very hard to dismiss is the ecosystems. You look at what did districts, and this plays out, I know the rural numbers better, but I'm sure that if you're looking at any minority community, you're going to see the same thing or much worse. But I think you look at what people have lost in terms of GDP production in rural areas, how much of the GDP did they contribute 10 years ago? And you'll find it was about half. And then rural communities now, it's half what it used to be. So now Democratic districts, for example, which tend to be more urban, actually produce about 63% of GDP. This was in the Wall Street Journal recently. And Republican districts, which tend to be more rural, produce half of that in the 30s, I think 36. And that used to be equal. And like I said, I'm sure that there's a similar story being told about all different types of communities of color in the United States. But I think focusing less on an individual, sometimes you don't see it. You don't see what's happened because a bunch of other factors come into it. Maybe it's age, or aging populations have had more time to accumulate wealth. So you're not necessarily seeing what's happened to the next generation. But I think when you look at an ecosystem, then you get more of a realistic idea of what the people are facing who are connected to that system, and how can you possibly have an equal opportunity if you're growing up in a place where all of the industries are dying, or if you're growing up in a community that is being systematically discriminated against in all kinds of ways. And so I think if we could try to find a way to shift our language a little bit, so we're not just talking about individual people, but also the places that they grow up in, the communities they have access to.
Yeah, I appreciate. Oh, go ahead, Gordon. Go ahead, please.
So Philip and Tara raised, really important points about things we shouldn't be afraid to talk about. The role of racism in these divides and confronting inequality head on. When we talk about inequality, my concern is that we end up focusing on the people at the top end, why Jeff Bezos is so rich, and we don't tell the stories, as Tara was mentioning, about the ecosystems and about kind of what's essential for life to work in areas that have been hard hit. So let me just give you one example there. This is unusual for economists. We don't give examples, we give statistics. But I want to tell you about a particular community, Martinsville, Virginia, which is in the southwest corner of the state. In 1990, 45% of able-bodied adults in Martinsville worked in manufacturing. It was one of these thriving manufacturing towns that had grown up in the South after World War II. Today, only 13% of able-bodied adults work in manufacturing. What did those old factories produce? Furniture and knitwear, and China just blew the place out of the water. That happens. The problem was Martinsville, because of the way in which its ecosystem is disconnected from the rest of the country, absorbed that loss by those workers essentially just leaving the workforce. In 1990, 3/4 of those adults in Martinsville had a job. Today, it's only 50%. And the consequence of that job loss, which is a fundamental part of talking about inequality, means people are losing their houses. And when they lose their houses, being able to maintain their small businesses, families break apart. And so understanding the nature of the shocks that are hitting these places and what it means in those communities is something I think has been missing from the discussion.
Yeah, the death spiral, right? Where a tax base shrinks, the schools suddenly are more impoverished, so they can't necessarily start investing in a different kind of education to train students. I mean, a whole lot of factors set in when you have a big shock like that. Housing prices drop when a factory closes at the exact moment that people would want to sell and move away. All kinds of things happen to a community that once you take away a lifeline like that, you can get a death spiral where the whole thing just falls apart and they can't rebuild.
Connor, were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think to look at the impact on minorities in rural areas, it's something we don't talk about that much. But in Alabama, we have the Black Belt, which is apparently named for the color of the soil that's there, but it's turned into, over time, this is sort of where some of the more majority Black areas in the South are. I think it goes all the way from Virginia to maybe Louisiana. And it's sort of a region of the country that's, very agrarian and has a long history of a lot of where the civil rights movement happened in these areas. And I think what you're seeing that's interesting and really disheartening is in places like Selma, for instance, that people are aware of, but other cities, smaller cities that are not as, that are more rural and that type of thing. As you see these economic opportunities dry up, you're seeing these, communities that have been, majority Black communities for years. These are counties in Alabama where, most of the elected officials are Black, that type of thing, which, I think a lot of people stereotypically don't know even exist. And as these communities are hollowing out, you're losing this like long heritage of Black Southern culture, Black Southern life, and people are moving sort of to larger cities. So not only are we losing economic opportunity and population, but you're also losing sort of just this heritage in America. And I think that's happening across the country too. You go to white farming communities in Indiana or something, I'm sure you're seeing a similar thing where people who've been there for generations are kind of just assimilating into cities. And not only are we seeing, sort of all these cities kind of homogenizing in a way, then corporations sort of are coming in. And when the local retailers are going out of business, you're seeing, Walmart or, increasingly Dollar General. There's a really interesting article in New Yorker recently about Dollar General, dollar stores coming in and just sort of replacing everything, all of which pay very low wages. Really, you can't sustain, an economic life off working at the Dollar Tree. In a long term, you can't build a wealth or build any kind of real life off that. And so some of these places are just dying, and I just don't see how they ever really come back. Some of these smaller towns, and as I was saying, they have these long-standing traditions and heritages, whatever race is, majority in those areas. And it's just, that's just another angle that I don't think we talk about that much.
Tara, were you going to say something?
I was just thinking how I think that this is one thing that I think does actually unite urban and rural US is this kind of almost depersonification of workers, where I read the sentence the other day that really struck me, where someone said it's almost like workers don't exist anymore, only their time exists. You buy 15 minutes of their time or you buy an hour of their time. And that's what the gig economy is essentially. It's like corporations, I think, used to have to take on workers, and it was more like a marriage. If the company did well, the workers did well, and you were responsible for them to some degree, whatever happened. And now the gig economy is the extreme opposite of that. The gig economy is that people are more or less expendable, and you really only ever have to pay for the exact 10-minute increment of their time that you use. And there's something really just lacking in fundamental dignity about that. I mean, it seems like the ultimate way that corporations and companies and even us as consumers are just using people without any regard to what they need in their lives, the fact that they're human beings. And on the extreme end of it, I think you see kind of Uber and just buying or TaskRabbit buying 15, 20-minute increments of someone's time. But I think you see it also with larger companies, Walmart and Amazon, where I know with Walmart, you work the exact amount that you can so that you don't have to have benefits, you know, the 39.5 hours. And what was it, 40% of Walmart employees are on food stamps. And the corporation is buying people's time, but it's not actually treating the workers as if they are human beings. It's a strange social contract that I don't think we had before. I think workers used to be treated like people. And if the company did well, the workers did well. And now you see this incredible divergence between how well a company is doing and the profits a company is making and how well its workers are doing. It's like,
That's a direct connecting of the dots between urban and rural in many different ways. I want to just, there's a few questions that came in. I'm going to kind of summarize them. We've gotten a lot of questions about two things. One, broadband and technology, particularly now at the COVID state that we're in, moving into the fall, and then schools. So I would really love to hear from all of you around, as we move into this question of schools in both urban and rural, and we already had challenges as far as disparities before COVID within urban and rural environments. But now with COVID, describe that challenge, which is in some cases a life and death challenge. In some cases, it's people just trying to survive with the economic conditions we're in. So I'd love to hear really from all of you, because there's a lot of anxiety and fear, quite frankly, around this question in a lot of different communities. I don't know who wants to jump in first.
I could weigh in.
Okay.
Or, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that a lot of these issues sort of combine together to create like what I think Tara referenced as the the death spiral of some of these communities. The jobs are sort of leaving these communities. You're seeing human beings leaving rural communities, and at the same time, obviously the tax base is falling. They have less money for schools. That probably less likely that it's obviously less likely that rural areas are going to have broadband internet or other services that can help them build economic opportunities. And as these continue, I think they wrap together to, so there's less economic opportunity, there's less money for schools, there's less people paying taxes, and it just turns into a almost inevitable thing where you're not seeing people have the same opportunities in rural areas that you might see in a city that's able to invest in some of these things. This also applies to social services and other things across the board, where it also increasingly becomes more attractive to move to a city if you can afford it, or if you can somehow have that opportunity. So I think a lot of this stuff kind of combines together with a lot of everything else we're talking about. And I think a lot, as you have more corporate control of businesses and that sort of thing, more of the money is being taken out of the community in other ways by the corporations and not reinvested. And it's very hard to see how that doesn't continue going forward and accelerate with what's going on with COVID. But, if anyone has a positive take on it, I'd love to hear.
I don't know about a positive take, Connor, but I do know that that the notion of or the dilemma that's posed about returning to school and is in fact parallel with the existence or non-existence of internet of infrastructure for many communities. I was surprised to learn, not too surprised, but somewhat surprised to learn from Telemundo that 40% of Latinx households have no access to the internet. That obviously poses an extraordinary dilemma for families in trying to educate their children via Zoom and WhatsApp and other away from school technology. So you could see why folks are of many minds. Parents who have to work in supermarkets or have to work in the Central Valley of Fresno area, so on and so forth. They have to be there. And then they have to wonder, well, what am I going to do with my kids? And the notion of sending your kids into a dangerous situation. You're already in a dangerous situation, and then sending your kids into a dangerous situation. When I think about rural America, I think about that's where rural America and urban America, in fact, find that's where the commonality exists on what doesn't, what is not available for many families, what is not available for many of these Latino families, whether they're in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a city, or whether they're in the Central Valley of Fresno, and then face, because they are the workers on the front line, face with what do we do with our children? Educate them at home where we aren't because we can't be there, send them to school where it's dangerous. We are dealing, it is indeed a dilemma. And I'm raising this both as a dilemma, but also as a possibility for change, to think differently about how we, the country, that is, when I say we, treat workers on the front line and their children. And how we think about the internet. We think about it almost, well, everyone has a computer. Well, everyone doesn't. But that's sort of the default assumption that we have as a nation. Our framework of assumption is such that what we have, we assume many people have, if it is as something as rudimentary as a computer. But of course, there are many who not only do not have a computer, who do not only have internet access, but don't have a computer at all. And I think that what this situation presents for us is an opportunity to think differently and to basically jettison assumptions about who, if you will, the basic haves and have-nots in our society. It's probably much worse than we ever assumed. Again, with that figure that I again heard the other day from Telemundo, 40% Latinx households without internet access. That's extraordinary.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're really living in an incredibly precarious moment when it comes to education. You look back over the past couple of decades, and one of the things that's really separated high income from low income households is the ability of high income households to invest enormously in their kids' K-12 education, either because one parent is at home or because you hire tutors, you have participation in clubs and all these activities. That mattered for kind of who got into more selective colleges. Now we're at a moment where that divide matters for who might finish high school or who might even go on to high school. And the intervention here, the thing that provides some optimism is that the intervention here is pretty simple. We make broadband available everywhere. We can do this in a 3-month period. You put Chromebooks in the hands of every kid who needs it, and we organize tutors on a national basis via Zoom to help these kids out. And this is happening in communities all over the place in the small. The resources it would take to do this nationally are just not that substantial. If we don't do it, we've got a couple cohorts of kids that are in danger of not even getting the chance to think about college.
Thanks, Gordon.
Hi. Okay, I had one more thing I guess I'll say, which is about inequality. I think, again, I think sometimes there can be a tendency to think that inequality is about, we have to fix this because other people are suffering and it's making other people's lives bad, which it is, and we should. But it actually makes everybody's life kind of bad. And I was talking to a friend of mine a couple months ago who's a very well-paid producer in LA. And he was expressing just a series of economic anxieties to me about how much money he needed to save for his kids. And he needed all this money put away so they could have the house and they could always have healthcare and what if one of them got sick and they need to have all this money for that, and then they need all the money for private school, and then what if they're not very good at their jobs, they need money for their kids' private school. And I just sat there thinking, if you have extreme inequality where for anybody living below, say, the 80th percentile, you know, life is really only okay for the top 20, and it's a real bummer for everybody else. It's just terrible for everyone. And something that you end up reading about is this professionalization of childhood, where upper class people now put their kids through this just ringer of extracurriculars, and you have to qualify, and there's no such thing as child anymore. You can't afford it. And the reason you can't afford it, even if you're rich or reasonably well off, is that you can't afford to fall down below that 80th percentile, because we've made life so unlivable. You know, it used to be you could be a school teacher or something, you could be a plumber, and your life would be fine. But as soon as you don't have a social safety net, and as soon as there's no healthcare, and as soon as those jobs are all really unpleasant down there because tech has hollowed out all of the jobs in the middle, you have this huge divide of a bunch of people who they're in the security circle and their lives are okay, but they live in perpetual terror of falling out of it. And then you have a lot of people who just live their lives in a great deal of stress because they never have health insurance, and they never are able to get their kids into a good school, and the public schools aren't great because we're not funding them. And so I think that this myth that inequality is about helping poor people is completely wrong. No matter how much money you have, when you go to sleep at night and you're worried about how your grandchildren are going to have health insurance, that's inequality. And it's because we've built a world where if you fall out of those top 1 or 2 quintiles, things start looking really precarious. And it doesn't have to be that way. It could be the case that your kid wants to be an artist. That's okay, because the system is functional and they'll still have a good life. And not everything has to be about getting into Yale from the time they're 3 years old. And so I think inequality and not having a safety net and not taking workers' dignity seriously, it's actually not about other people. It's about you, and you experience that anxiety every night, no matter how well off you are, when you are worried about the future of your kids.
The profundity of inequality, I'm afraid, Tara, is far worse than that. Inequality is when you feel and know that you cannot, for example, afford to jump on a bus that day because you don't have the fare. Inequality is when you are feeling that pain in your stomach because you're hungry. Inequality is when you can't go to a hospital and decide to suffer in silence or in pain or screaming mad because you cannot get into a hospital because you can't afford it. I'm afraid it is not, like something that can be summarized as some equitable form of pain or discomfort or anxiety. It's far more profound than that. I think we have to treat it as such in our storytelling and in our understanding of exactly what it is. It isn't just a question of some guy having $40 billion and some guy, like having $40 a week. It's far more pain than that. It's far more painful than that.
Well, I completely agree with you. People I know back in Idaho who are really on the wrong side of this. It's right. A lot more like what you described. But what I'm saying is, I think when we're sitting in a place like Harvard and we're thinking, I think sometimes it's easy to think, we're talking about other people's worlds. We want to make other people's lives better, and it really has nothing to do with us. And I think I think we're telling ourselves a lie there if we think that our world isn't impacted by that reality of other people's worlds. And other people can be suffering somewhere and that it doesn't reach us. It does reach us in a whole lot of ways. It reaches us.
Well, in that sense, I agree. I think I agree in the sense that a lot of folks think, well, racism is someone else's problem. Yeah. But if someone is racist, it is actually the country's problem. If that is what you're talking about. If we're talking about classism, it's not just the fellow down the street or someone in the Central Valley's problem, but it's also someone's problem in Hollywood, because it's what creates this inequality. Basically tears down the nation, and that is and communities and neighborhoods.
And no one could
and we're
ever
seeing
feel
that
secure.
now.
No one.
That's right.
No matter who
That's
you
right.
are, nobody ever feels fully secure. And I think,
Indeed.
and
Right.
I think that's probably true with all kinds of prejudice, where there's always a
Right.
slight risk that not just that it's other people, but that it's someone that you care about. Maybe it's you. And I think you're completely right. And it's something that I think white Americans need to come to terms with, that there is no separating actually of the fate of white and Black America. I don't think. I mean, and as long as we allow that kind of structural inequality to go on, it affects everyone. There's just one country. And I think that's true for all of us, whether it's economics or you're talking about gender divides, all of it affects everybody eventually. It comes back to you.
But it affects some more than others in terms of the real effect, in terms of the real impact. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. The study, someone asked a question. I just want to address it for a second about, someone pointed out that you find a lot of pain that's also happening economically in Asian American communities. And I find that to be an important question because of something I've been working on lately, which is looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and those who've endorsed it or opposed it. And within Asian American communities, you find, which is a huge community, like Latino communities, like Black communities, like white communities, you find different communities within communities. And among Asian Americans, you find a lot of support for Black Lives Matter, but you also find opposition. But I found something really interesting, and something a woman I spoke with who heads up Viet Aid, a Vietnamese immigrant center in the Boston area. Something she said. She said, in my neighborhood in Fields Corner, when gentrification came, and it's there in a big way now, that if Asian Americans are going to be gentrified out of their homes, I mean, if Black Americans are going to be gentrified out of their homes, the same thing is true for Asian Americans. They too will be gentrified out of their homes. And that is a reason why she cared for Black lives, among the reasons that she cared for Black lives. And this gets back to, again, something you and I were talking about, Tara, that a lot of these issues are connected. You have to connect the dots economically. And I agree, we have to connect the dots in terms of what all of these things mean, contextualized within a framework of assumption, our view of poverty, our view of racism, who it impacts, who is affected, who is left out. And that, I think, is a really good example, that which was advanced by Vivian Leigh, that's her name, the executive director for Viet Aid.
Thank
Turn
you.
it back to you.
Yeah, thank you both, Tara and Philip. So I want to start to wrap up because I want to try to end on time, and I'd like to really give each of you just a quick final thoughts. You know, what I heard in this discussion was we need to start connecting the dots. These issues of inequality, systemic racism, and otherwise, we need to start connecting the dots. They're not just isolated. We started with differences between urban and rural, and it's devastating what's happening in our country in both urban and rural. And there are some similarities around the hollowing out of jobs for various reasons in urban areas and various reasons in rural areas. So with that, I'd like to sort of wrap up. We started with the urban-rural question, and I want to get your final thoughts. Why don't we start with Gordon and
Sure. So I'll just highlight three things in terms of what we want to focus on for how we can move the needle, both not just for the rural-urban divide, but the broader economic divide in which we live. One is the dignity of work. Nothing happens. We can't change anything unless we are getting people into jobs. And that needs to be just a fundamental focus of policymaking. Two is something that Connor highlighted is what is lost when some places disappear. There is social capital, there are institutions, there are traditions, and we need to internalize the value of those things when we think about where we want that work to happen. I think only when we address those two can we go to the third thing that Tara was really emphasizing, which is not just the dignity of having a job, but the dignity of the job itself. And how do we try and restore some of the dignity that has been torn away by the economic change that we've undergone in the past 4 decades?
Thank you. Connor, do you want to offer some final thoughts?
Sorry, I was muted. I just want to, echo what you're saying about how important it is to look at this from a holistic perspective and just realize how these are all interplaying with one another. Issues of income inequality, education, access to resources, infrastructure. These are issues that, are broad across the country, that would require like very broad and strong, visionary approaches to. And I think we need to look at it that way, as like we need some kind of, there's going to have to be some kind of massive policy commitment if we're going to save some of these communities that are dying, as Gordon was talking about, or bring economic opportunities to people who just really right now are not, just don't have access to them. And I think it'll take a period of maybe generations to restore some of this stuff. And if we don't start doing it, I think we've already seen America change in ways that we probably couldn't have expected a couple decades ago. And I don't want to continue seeing it going. I don't think any of us want to continue seeing it go in the direction that it's gone. So I guess that's my take.
Philip, final thoughts?
First of all, I really appreciate this panel and the engagement by my colleagues here. This is extraordinary. My thought is that I feel that we should not fear changing the language and changing the way we look at issues affecting particularly poor people and people of color. I think it's great that we've been able to embrace and talk about the complexities of income inequality, for example. I think that we are, there an old system that is in a new term for many Americans. It's something that we could use in terms of that discussion, that advanced by Isabel Wilkerson, CAS. As a way of understanding where we are as a nation over the long term, and what we need to do in order to be the nation that we want to be. Basically, we have to eliminate racial caste and income caste in this nation. If we are going to basically advance, it's so important for us to rethink our language, to create a different framework of assumption of what we are as a nation, what we are as a people, and to cover stories on the ground. Those workers I was talking about in hotels or at supermarkets. It's so important for us to always be on the ground, to hear their stories, to hear their voices, and to understand how this pandemic is affecting people, not just in terms of numbers, which are important. I'm a data person myself and believe in it heavily, but it's so important for us to understand the pain that people are experiencing on the ground.
Thank you, Philip. Tara, final thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking how I think sometimes it feels kind of depressing and pointless, but we've had moments in our history that we have prioritized hard things before. We've had moments in our history where we've re-examined the role that corporations are playing and the way that they treat their workers. And we've had moments that we have taken on some of these really difficult questions. Some of them we haven't taken on nearly as well as we should have, and we dropped far too soon. Like our efforts at racial justice and desegregation. We sort of tried in the 60s, but what's remarkable about some of those efforts is how short they were, really. They weren't very sustained. But we have had moments, despite that failure, we have had moments where we've made big changes in the way that our system works and in the way that we allow companies to treat workers and things like that. So we can do this if we want to. If we create the political will, we can do it. It's something we can do.
Well, thank you, Tara, and thank all of you. This was a superb, excellent, rich discussion this last hour. And, again, we started with the urban rural question. And I think what we've come out of this is there's some universal changes that need to be made, not just in public policy, but how we talk about it in narrative. calling out, for example, this caste system that Philip continues to reference, calling out the real income inequality disparities, and telling those stories from the ground up is incredibly important. And I appreciate all of your perspectives, because this conversation needs to continue with a number of different people around the country, and it needs to continue with journalists and public policy makers as well moving forward. So thank you all for being on. It was a real pleasure, and thank you all who joined us today for this discussion. And I want to thank WGBH again for partnering with us. Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.